Monkey's Folly. The story takes place in the dense forest in colonial India. The story around a notorious leopard, the yellow basket, due to its insatiable hunger. A langur monkey makes a foolish error, perhaps venturing too close to the leopard's path or den. The yellow basket exploits the monkey's mistake, leading to a swift and brutal kill. That place is then named as Monkey's Folly. Soon after coming to Mandikara, Babs and I spent several days exploring it with the map. From the start, this map had intrigued us. It had come with the title deeds and looked like an old chart to some pirate's treasure. It was drawn in faded ink on yellowing parchment and was covered with figures and odd hieroglyphics. There were also mysterious references like old diggings and not here. At two places there were crosses, and at another the remark "no good" star. For us, however, this map had one serious defect. There was not, apart from the Denwa River, a single spot on the estate with a name. We decided to put that right, for how otherwise should we be able to explain where anything had happened unless the whole place was properly labeled with Devil's Punch Bowls and Lover's Leaps? To start with, it looked as though our task was going to be easy. After one glance at the mound on the ridge, we licked our pencil and marked it in as Spyglass Hill. Then we were stuck, for it is not at all easy to name bare scenery on the spur of the moment with something that fits. At the end of 3 days we were not much farther forward and the map had only a few obvious names on it like the pool, the Big Nulla, Rocky Ford, and the Old Well. For the next month or so more important things claimed our attention and the map was put away. Then, without any help from us, places started to name themselves. Creaking Tree Hill was the first. This is a small stony promontory on the ridge with a dozen or so trees on it. One of these creaks loudly, and on a still day can be heard for over a quarter of a mile. What actually creaks we still don't know. The sound comes up through the rocks from underground and is probably made by two roots rubbing together as the tree sways in the wind. Next came Somber Deep. This is a densely wooded patch with thick undergrowth that lies in an elbow formed by the Big Nulla. This place almost always holds somber, which are the largest and shyest deer we have. Not far from here is Dobie's Leap. This got its name from a washerman who once worked for us, a likable old reprobate called Biro. Most of the time he was under the influence of jungle juice and was reputedly his own best customer at a secret still he ran as a sideline in the depths of the forest. One day he limped home with his clothes torn and covered with blood. He had been strolling through the forest, he said, when a somber sprang up and started to chase him. He had only got away by leaping down a sheer rock face into the branches of a tree below. Nobody is yet sure whether the somber was a real one or not. Whistling Wood, as the name suggests, is another spot you can hear and went down on the map early. This wood is a small one of about 2 acres with a giant pipal tree towering up from the center. One night during a violent storm, this tree was struck by lightning and set on fire. It was not, however, completely destroyed. A lashing rain soon quenched the flames and so saturated the ground below it that the gale nearly blew it over. It stands today leaning at some 45 degrees. A part of the tree died and left one blackened limb pointing at the sky. In a short time termites hollowed this out and left it with a peculiar characteristic. When the wind from a certain direction has built up to a proper strength, a few melodious notes suddenly boom out. If you've got some imagination, the sound is not unlike the opening bars of Ave Maria played on an organ. After dark, even though you know what it is, the sound becomes eerie and vaguely disturbing. In a storm it is positively frightening, for then it builds up into a high whistling shriek which conjures up all the demons in hell. To the north side of Whistling Wood is Piccadilly Circus. Here, 5 game tracks meet, and if you want to watch animals at night, this is the place to sit. However, a stranger should always leave his imagination at home, for there are few spells when something is not on the move nearby and you don't always see it or know what it is. This keeps you on edge and tends to make you forget the whistling tree which booms suddenly and without warning. A stranger must beware of something else, too. Before he sits, he will almost certainly have heard from one of the forest folk about the little white grave near Pipal Tree. In this rest the ashes of a great hunter whose last wish was to remain among the jungles and the animals he had loved so well. Local superstition now says that a shadowy figure stalks through the darkness under the trees with a rifle at the ready. Monkey's Folly is another place that named itself. This lies right at the end of the Big Nulla, where it runs out into the river. Around here, there is always a troop of monkeys. From the high branches of the koha trees lining the banks, they can see a long stretch of the riverbed and any danger coming along it. To monkeys that means tigers and leopards creeping up to start the long stalk up the nulla. A lot of alarms begin here and are taken up from troop to troop for more than 3 miles. That brings us to the yellow basket. He was a leopard in the same class as every bit as cunning and perhaps a trifle bolder. Now all leopards are bad, but some stick in your mind more than others for some piece of villainy right out of the ordinary run. We christened the yellow basket rather too early, for he got this name when he was being just an ordinary nuisance. Towards the end, however, he had done something so terrible that we dropped the euphemism and called him what we really meant. This leopard had been about for some time and, to start with, had been content with an occasional goat. Then he committed his first act of real villainy. We had just bought our first pedigree cow and the basket took her on the 3rd day. To us it seemed like deliberate selection, for the cow was mixed up in a herd of some 50 nothing special animals. The kill took place after the herd had left the cowsheds and within 200 yards of the house. It had been both clumsy and noisy, for the basket was the small type of village leopard and really had no business to be trying for cattle. He dragged it only 25 yards, then the cowherds, who were not quite sure what had happened, rushed up and drove him off. Even so, in the short time that elapsed for them to race to the house and me to rush back with a rifle, the basket had returned and begun to feed. It looked an easy one. There was a suitable tree nearby, and within 15 minutes my Mackin chair had been hoisted up and I was waiting for the leopard to come back and finish his meal. Several times he was not far away. Once 2 frightened peafowl ran from cover and dashed past the kill, and on half a dozen occasions monkeys nearby spoke of their worst enemy. But first the lunch hour and then tea time went by with still no sight of him. Then the sun started to sink below the trees. Not much later the whole jungle was filled with the ruddy glow from a glorious sunset. Soon it was gone, and then the grey of dusk was deepening into night. All at once I noticed something odd. A patch of sunlight had been left behind on the toe of my right boot. I stared at it in surprise, not understanding, then I wiggled my foot and the sunlight disappeared. I looked down at the rifle lying beside me on the small platform that supported my chair. It was resting on the switch of the torch and the light was on. When I picked up the rifle, the batteries were nearly exhausted, the bulb showed only a dull red glow. This time I had no spare torch, though I never sit up without one. But who would think such a thing necessary when starting a sit-up at 10 o'clock in the morning? Indeed, the torch on the rifle was only there at all, because it goes on every night in case of a sudden alarm. Now, just when I should probably need it, it was used less. The basket came when it was really dark. The time was a few minutes after 8, for I had decided that if he had not come by 9, I should give him up and go home. The kill now was quite invisible as it lay under a patch of shadow, and not even the light from the stars touched it. I did not hear him coming, but the sudden sound of tearing flesh told me that he had arrived. What was left of the moon would not rise until after midnight. By then the basket would almost certainly have finished his meal and be gone. For as long as I could I resisted the temptation to fire blind at the sounds of feeding. The chance would be far better if he showed himself under the stars even for a few seconds. But after listening to him for half an hour I could stand it no longer. It seemed impossible to miss an animal the size of a leopard from less than 20 yards, even in the dark. I did not hurry the shot. I knew, after having looked at it all day, exactly where the kill lay. Towards this spot I pointed the muzzle of the rifle and then, by turning first one ear and then the other, aimed at the sounds of feeding. Then, holding steady and with the greatest care, I squeezed the trigger. As I have said before, this kind of shooting seldom scores, and it didn't now. I heard the leopard spring away, obviously unharmed. That he'd had a nasty fright I did not doubt. The crashing report must have burst in his face, and there had been a blinding flash from the muzzle. Then had come the clatter of the bolt and the tinkle of the empty case as it fell to the ground through the branches. But a really bold leopard is unpredictable. After a little more than 15 minutes I heard him come back. I could scarcely believe my ears, for although I have known leopards come back after being fired at, I had never had one return so soon. That stung me enough to try another shot, and I missed again. This time the leopard sprang away with a deep growl, but almost at once he was back and carrying on with his meal as though nothing had happened. There was now only one cartridge left in the magazine and I resisted the temptation to use it. But for all the good that came of keeping it, I might just as well have fired it off. The basket never showed himself once and went on eating until I thought he would burst. As a final insult, he cleaned his claws on a tree not far from mine and then strolled away with a loud belch. For several months after that the basket kept fairly quiet although he was still hanging about. In the normal course of events I should have kept after him for his presence was a constant danger to the stock, but at this time I was still doing night watchman round the fields. It was late one evening that the awful thing happened. The basket took Bimbo. Not Bimbo the Lungor monkey, but a little Cairn terrier of the same name. What was so bad about this was that Bimbo did not belong to us, but to some old friends Nancy and Tyrrell Hawkins, who had been staying with us. Nancy and Tyrrell stayed several weeks and then had to return to Jubbulpore, but as their plans were unsettled, they asked us to look after Bimbo. We gladly agreed to have him. He was a grand little dog and by now had become one of the family. However, Bimbo had one very bad habit: he loved to bark at monkeys, which is about the quickest way of all to call up a leopard. Now, all our own dogs bark at monkeys too if they think they can get away with it. Indeed, this habit is not an easy one to break completely because monkeys deliberately tease and seem to have some strange power that tempts a dog to be disobedient. Our dogs, however, are well aware of the monkey stick behind the door and of the high price that even a small bark costs. Of this stick Bimbo knew nothing, and as a guest we hardly liked to tell him. So to play it safe, we decided to take no risks and keep him either in a small compound near the house or tied up beside us on the veranda. It was a day several weeks later that Shirley and Ada Granville, from Pochmari, dropped in for lunch and tea. For most of that day, we just sat on the veranda and talked. Bimbo was tied up at one end of it and as usual he was very good. That was how we came to forget him until after tea. Then Babs remembered that he had not been out since before lunch. When he was let off the lead, he stayed for some time near my chair waiting for me to take him for his usual evening walk. That evening, however, I did not go out. Stayed talking to Shirley and Ada until they left at about 7 o'clock. No one saw Bimbo leave, but he must eventually have got fed up with waiting and then wandered off on his own. At first, we were not worried. Bimbo had been away on his own before, and although the danger from leopards is ever present, these pests are fortunately not so numerous as to be everywhere all the time. Besides, when we looked round, our dogs were missing, too. That surely meant they were all together and there was safety in numbers. At 7:45 our dogs came tearing back to the house. Something obviously was wrong, all of them were very excited and Jill was whimpering. There was no sign of Bimbo, though by now it was nearly dark. All at once we were worried. Very worried indeed, and at 8 o'clock, when Bimbo had still not come home, we called all the men up to the house and then set off to search with lanterns and torches. By midnight we still had found no sign of him, though we had by now called through every likely spot. As we turned for home, there was no doubt in any of our minds that Bimbo had been taken. Babs and I were very upset. To lose a dog of your own is a heartbreaking experience. To lose one belonging to someone else makes it 1,000 times worse. Soon after dawn the next morning I was out again. I still had no clue to where Bimbo had been taken from, and it was after midday before I found the first signs of the leopard. He had drunk at a small pool right at the end of the big nullah where it joins the river. It was another hour before I was sure that Bimbo was dead. For several reasons I decided not to sit up. Instead, I tied a goat at a spot nearby to which I could creep up from behind cover. During the afternoon I visited this spot several times and always found the goat alive. After tea I stayed near it, but out of sight, listening for some sign that would tell of the leopard's coming. But he did not come, nor had there been a single alarm from anywhere around when I went home after dark. As far as I could tell the leopard did not return during the night, although by dawn the next morning my goat was dead. It had been killed by a pair of hyenas. I did not tie out another. The weather was still cold and I thought I stood a better chance to get the leopard when he was taking the morning sun somewhere along the top of the ridge. So, each day at dawn when I came off the fields, I stalked along it with the rising sun at my back and the prevailing westerly wind blowing into my face, foot under the ground, and the dead leaves would be soaked with a heavy dew. Ideal conditions for stalking, and I was quite sure that soon or late something was going to tell me when the leopard was about. More than a week went by with no sign of him, so I started to haunt the ridge in the evenings as well. My luck was no better. It began to look as though the leopard had moved away to a healthier spot. The break eventually came one freezing cold morning soon after dawn. Nothing had actually warned me that the leopard was about, and I discovered him quite by chance. At one place the ridge is very narrow and falls steeply away from the path on each side. As I was crossing this, I noticed a bush laden with its small plum-like fruits halfway down the slope to my left. The plump red berries looked so nice that I decided to pick some for our 2 parrots. Before starting the climb down, I had a good look all round, and it was then that I spotted the leopard. He was almost hidden in a small ravine about halfway down the slope. I thought at first that he was asleep, for he was quite still and it was difficult to see him. The ravine was overgrown with lantana and only a small part of him was showing. But he was not asleep. A few moments later he started to creep forward and I soon saw why. He was beginning to stalk towards some monkeys on a kusum tree at the foot of the ridge. It was not possible from where I was to be sure of a shot, for although the ravine was shallow, it was so overgrown that the creeping leopard was more often than not behind cover. But I knew what he was after, and just a little way ahead a sunken path near the bottom of another ravine leads down from the ridge and would bring me out near the tree the monkeys were on. I was almost there when the monkeys screamed their alarm. The leopard had been discovered. I hurried down the path as fast as I dared, hoping that he had not claimed a victim, for if he had I was going to be too late, for he would already be away. When I got towards the end of the sunken path, the monkeys were still screaming. Now I could see the tree and it was alive with flashing gray figures tearing about it in panic. A few of the wiser monkeys were staying high up, but chattering with rage and shaking the branches furiously. I watched these, and saw that they were all looking towards a spread of bushes some 50 yards away, to my right. Although I could not see him, I knew that the leopard was somewhere there and that he had not yet caught a monkey. Now, unless you have actually seen it happen, it is perhaps difficult to believe that a leopard can catch a monkey on a tree. Nevertheless, monkeys do get caught frequently, for the leopard is their most deadly enemy and the mere sight of him strikes so much terror into their hearts that they often act like lunatics. Sometimes one of them may actually fall off the tree with fright, but more often than not the leopard's success comes from a piece of fathead reasoning which time and again tempts monkeys to their death. They are, of course, perfectly safe if they stay where they are, high in the branches. But not all of them do stay. There is often the odd one which, crazy with fear, casts desperately around for some way of escape. Suddenly he thinks he sees it and says to himself, "That tree over there is safer than this one." I saw the fool start from the top branches and work his way down the tree. When he reached one of the lowest limbs he went out slowly